Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Dow Jones webinar focused on the adapting to shifting sanctions and financial regulations. I'm Vera Akiotu, Director of Financial Crime Compliance Proposition at Dow Jones Risk and Compliance, and I'm responsible for developing and executing strategies with financial institutions across Europe. I'm joined today by Haider Manan, CEO of Big TXN, a Dow Jones partner. He is a data scientist and a subject matter expert in investment screening, specialising in ESG controversies, global sanctions, and also investment restrictions. I'm also joined by Katarina Helder, the MLRO and Head of Financial Crime Compliance at Handelsbanken Wealth and Asset Management. Katarina is responsible for ensuring appropriate controls are in place regarding all aspects of financial crime risks, including sanctions. There is also a chat function, and you can post questions in the chat box during this webinar, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to go through some of the questions. The increasing complexity of sanctions and financial regulations in this current geopolitical landscape necessitates a rigidity for financial institutions. We know sanctions frequently shift due to the political climate and also leadership priorities. The Trump administration established its foreign policy objectives, partly through tariffs to assert US economic dominance. Also, with Trump's recent trip to the Middle East, there's also been a shift in tone from the US towards Syria. Other focus areas include Iran. There, of course, is still the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and we saw a recent escalation between India and Pakistan, really highlighting a rise in geopolitical anomalies. And Haider, given some of these changes over the last few years, how have sanctions evolved and how are they impacting financial institutions more broadly?
Thank you, Vera, and hello, everyone. I don't think anyone will disagree with me that we were at one stage dealing with what we call traditional sanctions, and we are now very much in the age of modern sanctions. And the delineation point, I think, came in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea. So since then, sanctions have become very targeted, what we call smart sanctions that are focused on, specific individuals, entities, sectors, or domains or industries such as finance, energy, and or different types of technologies. We're also observing that sanctions are very dynamic and rapid, so they're adjusted very swiftly based on geopolitical developments, such as the Russia-Ukraine war, and they're rolled out on a much more rapid basis. And then, of course, we've also seen the increased use of secondary sanctions. So these target third-party countries or companies doing business with sanctioned entities, effectively globalizing, US or EU sanctions regimes. And they're much more commonly used by the US OFAC. So what we are now, I guess, seeing as an evolution of sanctions from what used to be broad-based sanctions regimes, such as disbarment entirely of Cuba or Iran, etc., because of all these targeted sanctions, we're seeing the cost of compliance and the relative infrastructure costs increase. And that burden of cost definitely increases on the amount that is spent on compliance staff, legal advice, software that you need to use for monitoring sanctions, and then, of course, the data that is needed on a real-time basis, sometimes for screening in processes such as KYC, AML integrations, and sanctioned security screening, which is, again, a very demanding area of operational complexity when it comes to sanctions. Let's not also forget cross-border transactions and how companies or financial services firms will then have multiple regimes where they have to comply with US, EU, UK sanctions. And then looking at things like geolocation filters, multi-jurisdictional legal reviews, and also having robust audit trails in that whole process. So, in a nutshell, those are some of the more obvious and um, some of the more obvious impacts of the evolution of sanctions over the last decade, and it just means that firms have to be better equipped in all of those areas from mostly a budget point of view to be able to cater for the advances and changes that are coming up. I will briefly touch upon this now, but I will cover it later in detail, is also the advent of crypto and digital assets has added an increased amount of burden for firms to be able to address issues where those digital assets are being used to circumvent sanctions as well.
And just to pick up on some of your comments, I think it also demonstrates how institutions operating globally must navigate different jurisdictions where sanctions may not be uniformly enforced, increasing the risk of inadvertent violations. And Katerina, sort of given your experience as a practitioner in dealing with the shifting landscape, what are some of the challenges around sanctions that you've come across, and how has your firm had to adapt?
Yeah, I think that the challenge is very much in what Heidi described, this, how they've evolved into something so much more complex over the years. And now we tend to talk about the sort of political sanctions and using it as a political tool. And that has become incredibly evident in the last, year or so, or even few months. But in a way, they're always political. That's what a sanction is. It's a political tool to change behavior. But I think there is a change in how it's used politically. And I thought I would just use an example to describe that complexity. So we'll have to thank Trump for providing us with a lot of examples recently. So, for example, it would be a traditional reaction to an event, a sanction. It would be things like the invasion of Ukraine or the murder of Magnitsky or Khashoggi that leads to sanctions. You use them to change behavior of a government, for example. And then, so in Syria, sanctions were imposed in 2011 because of the repression of civilians in the war, especially. And that was under a regime that is now gone. So you could argue that with that regime gone, we could now look at the sanctions, which clearly we are doing. And Trump announced when he was visiting the region that he would lift Syria sanctions. And as a compliance officer, I'm thinking, okay, great. Now we get to hear, how did we evidence that we're comfortable to do so? Because it should be quite hard to lift the sanction. But actually, the rationale he used was, I believe, it's their time to shine, which, again, could very well be the right decision because there is a new government in place. But how do we ensure that those behaviors that were there previously are not consistently, pertaining there? And again, that might be available, but that's not what we've seen. And we've also seen that this decision was made in close conjunction with receiving some very significant gifts, which makes it even more complex to kind of understand how do we react to that. So sanctions traditionally were something that you would find on a list. It's either on or off. You freeze or you lift, and you didn't have to think too much around that. Now, even with the sanctions lifting, I guess as a firm, you still want to consider a lot of the political aspects around that. And that started as well with the invasion of Ukraine, because you could say, I only freeze the funds and I only limit my exposure to the actual sanctioned parties. But most firms limited their exposure to either a whole industry or a whole region. So that's more of a risk appetite approach than it is a sanction. And I think that's the tricky bit in how we manage sanctions today. And that makes it very kind of political also internally, because it's not black and white anymore. And you have to consider your own appetite to that exposure and what could be sanctioned in the future and where could sanctions lift. And of course, it could be lifted somewhere, but not in another place. So then you have the potential of conflicting sanctions to take into consideration if you're an international firm and you operate in many of these regions. So yes, it has added to a lot of our challenges when trying to find a suitable framework and mitigating controls.
Yeah, and I think it's the complexity just adds another layer. But it's really interesting, some of the points you made around sanctions becoming a political tool in terms of driving the agenda. And then if we pivot slightly and sort of look into how automation can streamline compliance, Hyde, of course, there are a number of limited solutions in the market for securities monitoring. You know better than most, sort of having worked in this area for over a decade. What makes the solution good in getting fast moving designations, being responsible to market timing, and the actions that banks and other financial institutions have to make?
Yes, I mean, a good solution, in my opinion, is something that responds is responsive in terms of decision making for the financial services firms. I mean, that's the most important thing. Firms want to have the data available. They want to have it in an unambiguous way. So the solution must be technically robust, and it has to also strategically align with the compliance and operational needs of the firm. I'll quickly describe some characteristics of a solution that I think generically would meet the grade when it comes to a good securities data solution, and something that I think everyone should be aware of when looking for a securities data, sanctioned securities data vendor. I think, first of all, integration of as many securities feeds as possible. So, eliminating the dependency on a single feed is very important, because that feed could cause an issue at some point where it's missing data, or it may not be able to reliably keep up with the referencing of instruments that are sanctioned. So we always consider that, in today's world, you have API connectivity, you have all these sorts of things at our disposal, which we can use to connect to various feeds and ingest that data in an automated fashion, so that when we find entries that cross or are cross-referenced to watch lists, and when new designations are announced, those securities can be picked up quickly and the daily file can be refreshed. So I think that is something for which there's no excuse in modern day systems. And then, of course, alerting mechanisms are very important. So near immediate notifications that are pushed to compliance teams via, say, dashboards or emails, to be able to let them know that a specific security has been sanctioned, or is now under the scope of sanctions, is very helpful to know. I think one of the other interesting points that has been raised has been the advent of rationale. Something that we very much do keep to is to add contextual enrichment. So after name matching and corporate issuer matching, and finding the correct entity by way of entity resolution, contextual enrichment is something that historically used to be adding metadata like country data, sector data, known associates, known subsidiaries, and risk scores for prioritization, those kind of things. But more recently, contextual enrichment has also expanded to adding legal rationale for the status of the security and why it falls under the scope of sanctions. This really helps compliance analysts and those that are working on the front line to be able to distinguish very quickly why that security has been found to be in breach of sanctions. Then I think the speed alone isn't enough, because false positives waste time, false negatives can lead to violations. So precision is critical. What I think we have always followed is a principle where we have what we call AI as augmented intelligence. So before any data flows into the file, it has to be vetted by a human being, no matter how quickly the machine discovered that data and connected those securities to those relevant sanctioned entities. We still ensure that there's a human element before the data enters the file, so that we are not letting anything downstream become a false positive or a false negative.
Yeah, I think it's definitely shows that automation offers significant potential for enhancing sanctions compliance efforts. And Katerina, what role does automation play for you in improving risk management around sanctions? And also, maybe as a follow up, when is it necessary to also seek external assistance?
Yeah, I think in financial crime, there are lots of different processes that you need to manage. And a lot of that is possible to manage manually if you're a smaller firm, for example. Sanctions is probably not one of those, because I can't see today how, whether you need client screening, which we all need. If you're a payment service provider, you need payment screening, or like now when I work for a wealth manager, you need to do your investment screening. It's sort of not even thinkable now, I think, to do that manually. How would you keep up with all the changes to the various lists that you want to keep track of? And even more so, especially in the investment screening space, where it's all about the ownership and the control of firms, you would need an army, essentially. So there's no way of doing that manually. So I think automation has become incredibly important. And with that, I just mean regular automation for now. When we move into AI space, I mean, that could probably be a completely different ball game. But for now, just automation in terms of using lists to screen against and having a tool to do that, I don't think anyone would manage without. And then it also comes to that, like you said, Heide, that really importance around sanctions in particular. There's no suspicion here. It's like it is or it isn't, and you really do not want to have false negatives, but also your false positives can really kind of topple your workload, and you could miss things. So it is very much around that balance. And also, when do you need external help? Well, I think that depends a lot on what type of firm you are. So if you're a huge international bank, you might keep a lot in-house, maintain an expert team, your sanctions team that will keep an eye on external developments, that understand the systems, can tune them and all that kind of things. But when you operate like I do right now, I'm a bit like a GP. For financial crime, right? I kind of look after all of the risks, and then when I need expertise, I need to outsource that. I don't have time to become a sanctions expert. I need to understand the overarching risks, and then I kind of need to get to the people who can help me out, which is why I have friends like Heider. And I think that element is really important. You do need to understand when you need that external help, but you also need to be really clear on how that external help meets your requirements. And I think that's where a lot of firms fall short, that we go to get that external help. We think, oh, thank goodness, someone is in, we'll sort it out. But then when you need to explain what's going on to a regulator or an auditor, you can't, because you haven't quite gotten into the details. So there's no escaping understanding how it's done and how you explain that to someone else and all that kind of stuff, and outsourcing elements and things like that. But you do need that expertise in terms of being able to manage the risks if you're a smaller firm.
No, agreed. And I think like we can all agree on the need for automation, especially in the security space, with indirect links to be able to run effective sanction risk mitigations. And just touching on what Heide mentioned about that human in the loop piece. And then also the other important element is also having good data. What was also interesting is that we recently ran a poll question to ask firms what are some of their biggest challenges in staying compliant. And the choices were: number one, rapidly changing sanctions; number two was automating compliance; number three was compliance versus efficiency; and number four was all of the above. And what we found actually was 75% of respondents replied to all of the above, so not too surprising. But Heide, looking at some of the best practices around real-time risk mitigation, are there examples that you can cite?
Yes, certainly. I mean, laying the correct foundation, I believe, is the first thing that a firm can do to be able to harness any benefits, of real-time risk mitigation. Because I think if your foundation isn't laid down correctly from a compliance policy and compliance, domain perspective, then unfortunately everything else that comes after that can be just a muddle and can be tricky to navigate. So we're all aware that dynamic watch list management is available off the shelf. You don't really need to go and look at OFAC's website or the EU website or any of those websites unless you really want to. All of that information is already pre-parsed. It's containerized and packaged, ready for consumption. I mean, that's how we also do it today, where we take that assured data from providers like Dow Jones, where that information is embedded into our systems, and whenever that information changes, we are able to keep track of it. That doesn't mean that we do not maintain rules-based filters, which allow us to prioritize certain features in the data, like when we get Russian banks or energy sector firms or those kind of things, we are able to identify securities there much faster because those are known domains for us. But at the same time, we do use a lot of version control and audit trail within our process so that we maintain the defensibility in audit and enforcement investigations if they ever had to come to our customers, for example. And I think that's the foundation and principle of any compliance establishment or framework, is to be able to defend in an audit or an enforcement investigation how you came to that decision, where that paper trail is, and where that data originated from. So those are things that we take a lot of pride in as a vendor, and we expect that process mirrors the ones that our customers are also following in their day-to-day compliance life. Then I think everyone does understand that you do need a workflow-driven case management and responses. So triaging and escalating issues based on geography, based on client exposure, based on risk scores. I think that's something that firms have to decide internally for themselves in terms of where their pressure points are, and where they can take the limit further. Sanction securities are, by their very nature, quite black and white. So exceptions can be made based on counterparties and who you're doing business with, and who that portfolio is being created for. I mean, I think Katrina is much more proficient in this area than I could be, because she sees this on a day-to-day basis, and various types of customers can present themselves, and then you might be creating various shapes of portfolios for those customers. So timely and well documented decisions based on how you created those portfolios, and at the time the risk profile is static. At the time the risk profile is X, and then 3 months down the line the risk profile will be Y. So things change. It's not just sanctions that are changing the nature of the risk. It's also the individual and what activities they're carrying out and where they're based or domiciled that is changing the risk profile based on their own exposure. So I think documenting all of these decisions at the time of onboarding, and then having a recurring process to ensure that the customer's holdings or the client's portfolio is correctly screened every quarter, and that you have the results stored and ready to be shown to an auditor or an investigator if they were ever to come to you. Then I think in today's age we are prone to volatile upsurges in designations, for example, or where we require systems, both people and machine, to be able to scale instantly to meeting the demand of a large designation, or understanding the impact to securities and our book of trading, for example. So that's also very important to keep in focus. And then lastly, I think Katrina mentioned AI. I think AI will become a dominant force in compliance because it helps to take away a lot of that manual workflow, and also addresses some of those processes in a more intelligent way, when we need to be able to find direct solutions to what we call forks in the road type of situations. And if you have the correct rules-based maps within the system, then I think AI would be much more formidable in translating those into decisions. Of course, with the human gatekeeping element by its side. So, it's very useful for those kind of decision pathways, and I think it will become an active force in managing your risk.
And Katerina, from your experience, are there any particular areas that you feel firms should prioritise?
So I'm going to sound like the typical compliance officer now when I say you need to understand your risks to prioritize, because priorities are individual for firms. So you can't really say, well, of course you can say that, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we all went and checked our exposure. If you were in a wealth manager, probably your client base, if you were, in the transacting with the region in trade finance, you would have a much bigger issue and so forth. But in most circumstances, it is down to what you do, what your exposure is, and then you set your priorities accordingly. So I think it all comes back to making sure you assess your risks, your inherent risks, and then also understand your control environment. And then you would probably prioritize from there. And make sure that you understand that your controls are effective, and like Heide mentioned, describe how you're comfortable that they are effective and how you test them to make sure. And that's particularly important, of course, if you introduce new systems and things, that to ensure that you have that regular checkpoint and make sure that your thresholds and your scenarios are working. But that's sort of from a risk perspective. And then I also think it's important that firms really have a good think about their appetite and tolerance that goes beyond the pure sanctions, because you can control your sanctions exposure by, choosing your area of business, and you could even cut down certain areas and certain products or certain services to reduce your risk if that's how you want to deal with it. So I think that open conversation between the business side of the firm, the compliance side, and everyone needs to be really clear. I can work anywhere as an MLRO and look at controls and manage any type of risk. I don't set the risk myself. It's not down to me to make sure we mitigate everything down to low risk. So in a previous life, when I was working for a MENA bank, with trade finance, suddenly it was a completely different risk landscape. And I had to explain to board that perhaps we can't say that we have a low risk appetite, because quite frankly, we couldn't be doing what we're doing. And you have to accept that you will have some sort of implications if you get things wrong. And now I work for what I would call a very low risk firm in this space. So it's sort of, the priorities are driven by those factors. And I think that's why the priorities should be to make sure your risk assessment is up to date, make sure you have your right, the tolerance levels and the appetite agreed, so that you can then navigate the controls, because that's where I'm responsible, is to make sure that those controls are proportionate. So yes, not a one answer for all on this one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I think to your point, and also some of the points that Heide's made, is that overarchingly is that firms must manage their sanctions risk by being adaptive, looking at their operational model, but also having a robust risk management framework in place. There have been a couple of questions that come in. I think we've perhaps got a minute to answer this one. So the question is, the Trump administration is leading the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. What might be some of the implications for banks in the post-war era? Heide, would you like to, or Katerina?
I think that's a very difficult one. Obviously, it's going to have to be to follow developments very closely and understand when things change. I mean, in some respects here, we should be expecting lifting of sanctions rather than adding to sanctions, which can be equally tricky, of course, but you have a little bit more, you have a bit more of your own decision making to do there, because just because sanctions are lifted doesn't mean you have to go back to what you used to be doing.
Yeah, I would agree with Katrina that you have a lot more latitude when de-designations happen. and it's also not meant to be a green light that you should be re-entering that market or picking up that stock again to trade, or entering the market from the perspective of taking risk again. So there are scenarios that are still legal scenarios that still have to be considered before you can do that again.
Thank you both for your time today. I think it's been a great discussion. And for our audience, if you're interested in learning more about Dow Jones supports our customers in this area, please feel free to reach out to us directly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.